So this class today will be about globalization. Next week, I want to turn briefly to the background theme of the course, the alternative futures not of the market order, which has been our primary concern, but the alternative futures of economics itself. And then in the last class, I'm not going to make any presentation. I want to devote that to open-ended discussion. And hope you will come prepared with comments and questions, maybe regarding the papers that you will be writing. And we should devote that class entirely to a discussion of central themes in the course raised by you. Now, globalization. My plan for today is the following. First, I want to give a brief historical introduction to the problem of globalization as we face it today. Second, I want to describe the main direction of the established form of globalization as illustrated by the direction taken by the World Trade Regime. Third, I want to address the relation between alternative forms of globalization and national alternatives, political economic alternatives within the nation state, what has been up to now our main theme. Fourth, I want to discuss the thesis of my co-teacher, Danny Roderick, in previous versions of this course, under this label of his, the trilemma of globalization. And fifth, I want to place this discussion of globalization in a larger context of ideas about world order and disorder today. So first then, the historical preface to the discussion of globalization. In the history of the last 150 years, globalization has come twice. First, in the period between 1870 and 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, and then from 1946, the aftermath of the First World War, to today, accelerating from 1970 on. In 1971, the United States went off the gold standard. In between, that is, in the period between the two great world wars, there was a dramatic breakup of the globalization project as it had existed before. An enormous wave of resistance, political and ideological, as well as economic, to globalization as it had been designed up to then. So the current globalization that we witness is then the expression of this second wave. Now, it is not possible to say in any simple way that the second wave of globalization has gone further than the first. Gross capital flows are certainly larger now than they were then, but net capital flows remain smaller as a percentage of GDP. The level of trade flows as a percentage of GDP has only recently become larger than it was in the first wave. And migratory flows, the flows of people across national borders, are much, much smaller in the second wave than they were in the first. So if we seek to compare these two waves of globalization by the simple quantitative criterion of which went further, we cannot say that the present one has gone further than the earlier one. Now let's turn to the qualitative comparison and contrast of these two waves of globalization. The fundamental similarities are first, that both of them took place under the aegis of an idea of convergence, of institutional convergence, of convergence to the best available institutions and practices. And second, that in both cases, this idea of convergence was enforced by the discipline of capital. Now let me say a word about each of these similarities. First, convergence. In the earlier wave of globalization, there's a loose, vague idea of convergence, that as countries progressed, as they developed, they would converge to the model, to what was imagined to be the model of best institutions and best practices, then most visibly represented by Britain. And in the second wave, the convergence is imagined in a much more perspicuous or systematic way, as we shall see, backed up by the discipline of economics. But in both cases, both the earlier wave, in which there's the looser idea of convergence, and the second wave, in which convergence is expressed much more dogmatically and in greater detail, there was a mechanism to ensure that countries would converge. And the mechanism is what I'm calling the discipline of capital. In the first wave, it was the gold standard. The gold standard has been described by the Polish Marxist economist Kalecki as making the level of economic activity depend on the level of business confidence. If there's a failure of confidence of the asset-holding classes, of the business elite, in the economic policies or practices of a government, gold would automatically flow out. And the diminishment of the gold reserves of an economy would impose an absolute constraint on its ability to trade with the rest of the world. The United States, as I said, went off gold in 1971, and in general, the gold standard has been abandoned throughout the world. But in much of the world now, it turns out that there is a functional equivalent to the gold standard, in what you could call the neo-gold standard, that has the effect, the practical effect, of reinstating the situation that Kalecki described, of making the level of economic activity depend on the level of business confidence. In the advanced countries, in the rich countries of the North Atlantic world, the functional equivalent to the gold standard is sound finance doctrine, the orthodox reaction to Keynesianism, and now enshrined in the practice of the central banks, the inflation targeting regime, the commitment to free-floating exchange rates, and the commitment to maintain, wherever possible, a primary fiscal surplus, a surplus of government revenue over expense, disregarding the servicing of the public debt. Now, in Latin America especially, which is the part of the world which has been most disposed to sign on to the instructions it received from the political, economic, and academic authorities of the North, the functional equivalent to the gold standard has been very clearly drawn. And it has included a reliance on a very low level of domestic saving, a consequent dependence on foreign saving, that is, on foreign capital, an opening of the capital account, and an emphasis on fiscal discipline that underlines restraints on public spending more than raises of the tax take. The dependence that this functional equivalent to the gold standards imposes on national governments, the dependence on foreign capital, the dependence on business confidence, rather than being seen as a problem, is seen by the defenders or proponents of the functional equivalent to the gold standard as a solution. It's a solution because it supposedly ties the hands of national governments and makes it harder, if not impossible, for them to embark on populist and nationalist adventurism. So that combination of an idea of convergence with its practical imposition by the functional equivalent to the gold standard is a notable effect of this second wave of globalization. Now, of course, not all countries in the world have adopted this functional equivalent to the gold standard. So within the same present regime of globalization, there has been a wide range of responses to the constraints that it imposes. And the Northeast Asian economies, initially Japan, then the so-called Asian tiger economies of Korea and Taiwan and to some extent Singapore, and now China, have all responded to the same constraints of the second wave of globalization without embracing this functional equivalent to the gold standard that has been so prominent in Latin America. And the result is that they have had more space, more maneuver to establish rebellious strategies of national development, strategies that do not require genuflection at the altar of financial confidence in the early stages of development. So they can rebel, they have a buffer. The buffer is domestic saving and large hard currency reserves. The buffer allows them to deviate from the orthodoxy. Then if the deviation is successful, as it has often been, economic reality prevails over the religion of finance, and capital goes there anyway, because in the middle term, capitalism wants results and opportunities and not pieties. So the pieties matter only in the initial steps of the process. What matters later on is reality. Now, those are the two basic similarities between these two waves of globalization. What then are the differences? The first fundamental difference is a momentous change in the international division of labor. In the earlier period of globalization, when the primary form of advanced production was mechanized manufacturing, world trade was organized primarily around the axis of exchange between rich countries, rich in capital, and poor developing countries, relatively richer in labor. So the most advanced forms of production headquartered in the rich economies, and then the more primitive forms of production, more dependent on the extraction of natural resources, in the developing countries. And this was the predicate of classical trade theory. The central terms of exchange were exchange between countries rich in capital and countries rich in labor. Now we have, although it often goes relatively unremarked, a change in the nature of the international division of labor. The new vanguard of production, the knowledge economy, is established throughout the world in the major economies, not only in the United States, Germany and Japan, but also in China or India or Brazil. And you could say even that the commanding force in the world economy, to the extent that there is a commanding force, is the network of these vanguards. High finance is a sideshow to the main story, despite its capacity to produce episodes of tremendous economic instability. The second major change has to do with the dramatic shift in the relative significance of flows of people. Migratory flows were much, much greater in the first episode of globalization than they have become in the second. And this is a very significant fact for the following reason. By far the most significant factor in diminishing inequality among countries rather than inequality within countries would be greater labor mobility internationally. Every other factor that you can imagine pales in significance to this one. So the radical reduction in migratory flows has had a dramatic effect on the relation of globalization to the diminishment of inequality among countries. Now, the third difference is much more intangible than those two. The third difference is that now both the idea of convergence and the resistance to convergence are much more clearly stated and enforced in the present episode of globalization than they were in the previous one. In the first wave of globalization, there was a vague, loose idea of convergence, as I described it. Now there is a canonical form, and it goes under labels like the Washington Consensus or the Augmented Washington Consensus. There's a movement of ideas and policies, neoliberalism, backing up the program of convergence. In the earlier episode of convergence, the resistance to convergence came from the reactions of what Naipaul called wounded civilizations, trying to preserve their historical legacies in the face of the advance of the rich Western countries. Now the resistance to the idea of convergence is programmatic as well. And it too is armed with ideas, with doctrines that oppose the globalist neoliberal agenda. Now, this gives you a sense then of what the central problem in our discussion must be. The central problem in the discussion cannot be more or less globalization. The central problem in the discussion has to be which globalization. So just as the central problem in most of the course in the arguments over the semester was not more or less market vis-a-vis government, more or less state, more state, less market, more market, less state, synthesis of market and state. So now the discussion has to be what globalization, which globalization, in what direction, and with what consequence. And that's what I'm going to take then as the guiding theme in the rest of this discussion today. Now, before going further, let me ask if there are any questions suggested by that historical preface to the argument. Yes?
Yes, thank you, Professor. Could you elaborate a little bit more about the concept of convergence? What does that mean exactly?
Well, the concept of convergence is that there's one way to go. It's the idea that the countries in the world start out with different institutions. with different economic policies, with different versions of the market order, and they come together to the best version, to the most successful version, which earlier was represented especially by the European countries, especially by Britain, and later on by the United States. So that's the idea of convergence. There's a better version of the market. There's one version of the market, and that's the of the market order, and that's the version to which the whole world should converge, and according to this view, for the most part, does converge. Those who converge faster or better or more successful than those who converge later or less. That's the idea of convergence. And now it's canonized, it's given a canonical form by the neoliberal doctrine. So of course, you can see its relation to what I described in an earlier moment, and will return to discussing next week, of fundamentalist economics, the Hayekian idea, Hayek's idea, which I describe half facetiously saying, if Robinson Crusoe traded long enough on his island, he would eventually reenact the whole system of German private law. In other words, the market order is like a package that has a predetermined content. If you buy the package, you don't get to choose the content. The content is inside. It's already predetermined. You open up the package and there's the content. That's fundamentalist economics. And globalization is, as it were, the reflexive form of this idea that the market has a single natural and necessary form in the relations among economies in the world. That's the idea of convergence. Now, one way to examine, were you going to ask a question?
Yeah, I would love to ask, two of the differences that you identified between the first and second period of
Yes.
globalization seem to perhaps cancel each other out. For example, before you had, in the earlier period, advanced production in rich countries, but you also had migrant flows. Perhaps nowadays with global, that advanced production being more dispersed across countries, the need for migrant flows is no longer significant.
The need for them, you say? Well, remember that the knowledge economy that we have in the world is not a knowledge economy for the many. It's an insular knowledge economy. So it employs a tiny fraction of the labor force in the countries that might send people. So if there were this inclusive knowledge economy, which is socially inclusive knowledge economy, which in fact doesn't exist, then one could understand why they would want to stay at home, but there isn't. And the real situation in the world is the situation that I described in an earlier class, saying that in most countries in the world, in the vast majority of the most populous countries, most people are poor. If not poor absolutely, if not absolutely poor, then at least relatively poor. But their horizon of aspiration is a petty bourgeois horizon. What they aspire to is a modest prosperity and independence. And by default, if other options are not available, then to isolated, archaic, traditional family business based on self-exploitation and family saving, and with relatively primitive practices and technologies. And the spiritual counterpart to those economic forms is materialism, consumerism, individualism. That's the petty bourgeois horizon. And to this phenomenon, I gave the label the subjective petty bourgeoisie, because it's not as if the majority in the world were part of a small business class. They're not, they're still poor. And this idea that they will have their own enterprise, for the most part, is just a dream. But that is the direction. And they have embraced then this culture, this consciousness of self-help and initiative. On that view, the task of the progressives would be to come to them, to approach, rather than to demonize them as a petty bourgeoisie in the making, to see in them the future and to offer them alternatives, both economic and spiritual, alternative ways to achieve that dream of modest prosperity and independence. So that's the context in which this absence of migratory flows occurs. So when people do move, despite all difficulties among countries, often it's precisely those among the poor who most have this entrepreneurial direction and seek then opportunity and fortune in another part of the world. So I don't think there's this contradiction. I think, on the contrary, this situation that I describe directly exemplifies this situation. When you take into account the two crucial things I just mentioned, one is that the knowledge economy, for up to now, has been a project for small elites who have found a way to divide the process of production. The part that is commoditized or routinized, they subcontract to workers and firms in other parts of the world. And the creative and lucrative core they keep for themselves. And then the second element that you should combine it with is this allusion to the circumstance of the majority of humanity, this subjective petty bourgeoisie, poor in its objective circumstance, but already with a petty bourgeois horizon of aspiration. Now then, we come to this question of the direction of the present project of globalization. And for that purpose, it is useful to focus on the world trade regime. Because after all, in economic matters, there are two main domains. One are the international monetary arrangements, and the other are the international trade arrangements. Now, the most notable thing about the international monetary arrangements is the survival or persistence of the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, with the practical effect of making much of the world, almost the whole world, dependent on the ups and downs of American monetary policy. And this, of course, gives a powerful inducement to the rest of the world to overthrow the reign of the dollar and to establish alternative ways to deliver the money to fund world trade. And that's happening. It's happening much more slowly than one might have imagined, but it is happening. I do want to focus on what seems to me the most significant domain in which to examine the direction of globalization, which is world trade. And the world trade regime, not simply as it is exemplified by the WTO, the World Trade Organization treaties, but also by the multilateral pacts like the transatlantic and trans-Pacific partnerships that are currently under negotiation in different forms. They're now, as a practical matter, much more important than the WTO treaties. The WTO has been, to a significant extent, emptied out, but it exemplifies the direction that I want to describe. So, what then is the form that globalization takes under this established trade regime? The trade regime that, as I say, is exemplified not just by the WTO itself, but by the subsequent multilateral trade arrangements. The first is to consider the maximization of free trade in goods and services, as a good or an end in itself, not simply as a conditional good or as a means to another end. And you could say, well, there's nothing self-evident about that. Good free trade among economies is not inevitably or in itself a good. It's sometimes good and sometimes bad. What's the alternative view? The alternative view is that the goal of the world trading system should be the creation of an open world economy, a world economy that gradually becomes more open in the context of the differences among national development strategies and civilizations in the world. That is, the open world economy that we would want on a different view is the open world economy that can serve as the setting of this experimental coexistence in the world of different national development strategies and different civilizations, different ways of being human, different forms of existing society, of organizing society. The open world economy that we want is a world economy that is accessory to that larger goal, and that does not take the maximization of free trade as a good in itself. You could say the maximization of free trade is sometimes good and sometimes bad. What is absolutely good is the ability of humanity to exchange people and ideas throughout the world and to unify by becoming more diverse. And that would set us on a different conception of the aims of globalization. Now, the second characteristic of this dominant globalization project seems to me to be the decisive one. And I want to describe it as a kind of institutional maximalism, an institutional and legal maximalism. It wants to impose on all the countries that participate in the world trade regime, not just submission to the market economy, to the idea of the market economy in the abstract, but acceptance of a very particular version of the market economy. For example, it should be a version which outlaws, under the label subsidies, all the forms of strategic partnership between governments and businesses that the countries that are now rich used in order to become rich, but they want to deny to the latecomers. So the label subsidies then becomes an elastic label that is used then to prohibit these forms of association between governments and businesses. Or to take another example, it wants to enshrine as part of the world trade regime, to which all the trading countries must accede, the regime of intellectual property that has the practical effect of leaving many of the technological innovations of greatest interest to humanity in the control of a handful of multinational businesses. For example, the medical technologies and inventions. And the question is there an alternative to this institutional maximalism? Now, there must be an alternative, because the regime that immediately preceded the WTO, which was the regime of the GATT, of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, was characterized by an opposite principle, the principle of institutional minimalism, the maximum of openness with the minimum of restraint on institutional innovation, including innovation in the forms of the market order itself. And this contrary characteristic of the GATT was in turn preceded by many centuries of experience in the development of the law merchant. The law merchant was the international law of trade in late medieval and early modern Europe. And it was organized precisely to permit countries with radically different economic institutions and laws to trade among themselves. So, for example, if the Hanseatic League on the Baltic Sea of the countries that were limiting the Baltic traded with Russia, with the Russian Empire, everyone understood that these were different civilizations, different states with different laws. And the project of the law merchant was to make it possible to organize trade internationally despite the difference in the underlying commercial law and the underlying jurisdictions and national states. That was what the law merchant did. And it was able to go very, very far in this project of creating a basis for trade on top, despite the underlying legal difference below. Now, the premise of the economists is that any underlying difference in law is an embarrassment, an inhibition to trade, because it raises what the economists call transactions costs. But of course you could say if you followed that logic to the hilt, if you carried it to the end, then you would say, why have a difference of national sovereignties at all? Why not just have one economy in the world under one state? That would make things easier. Then there would be no transactions costs, but there would also be no diversity. Because after all, the distinction of national sovereignties is part of the framework within which productive diversity arises. And it is then the basis for the creation of the diverse material from which the mechanisms of competitive selection select. If you were to judge a mechanism of competitive selection, its fecundity depends not only on the competitive rigor of the selection, but also on the richness of the diverse material that is selected. So the whole point of trade between the countries or city-states of the Hanseatic League and the Russian Empire was their difference. It was because their difference that trade was interesting and that the logic of Ricardian comparative advantage could take effect. So that's then the reason to protest giving an absolute value to this idea of transactions costs as a limit on underlying productive diversity. So you could say what we should want as an alternative globalization would be to base it on institutional and legal minimalism rather than on legal and institutional maximalism, following the example of the law merchant and of the general agreement on tariffs and trade, rather than following the current example of the WTO and the subsequent multilateral trade agreements. Now, the third characteristic of this dominant form of globalization has to do with the remarkable contrast between its treatment of capital and services and its treatment of labor. After all, labor is one of the factors of production. The basic idea, simplifying, is that money and goods and services should become as free as possible to cross national frontiers. But labor should be imprisoned within the nation state or within blocks of relatively homogeneous nation states like the European Union. So that's a third characteristic of this dominant form of globalization. It's radically differential treatment of things and money on one side and people on the other. Now, there's no basis for that in either economic theory, abstractly considered, or political theory, the political theory of democracy. Why should one of the factors of production, people, not have a freedom comparable to the freedom of money and things? You could say the principle of the alternative form of globalization would be money, things, and people acquire freedom together in little incremental steps, rather than having the situation in which money and things have as much freedom as possible right at the outset, and people remain behind. Now, of course, the radical and instantaneous emancipation of labor from restraints on mobility across national frontiers would be a revolutionary event. So it couldn't take place all at once. It would create revolution all over the world. So we have to imagine that it takes place gradually, in little steps, with safeguards and compensations. For example, if the countries from which workers leave send skilled labor, then they should be compensated for their investment in the skilling of that labor. And on the other hand, the countries that receive labor should have a graduated scale of different forms of incorporation. Temporary labor permits, eventually permanent residency, and only at the very end, citizenship. But the question is not how far any one step goes. The question is, what is the direction? And that's then a third basis for contrasting these two projects of globalization, the established project, the dominant project, and the alternative project that one might propose. Now one could add to these three areas of contrast a fourth possible one, which has to do with the freedom of labor. So an open world economy should be based on free labor. But what is free labor? We had that discussion before in the course. Does it mean economically dependent wage labor alone? Or does it mean that there's some openness, some direction of creating the conditions for the institutional experiments that might allow the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, to be reconciled with the imperative of economies of scale and gradually to become the more prominent basis of an open world economy? But once again, it points back to the primacy of institutional innovation, innovation in the legal arrangements of the market order. So there's a simplified account of a contrast about alternative, the reflexive expression or form of this debate about alternative forms of the market order is the debate about alternative directions of globalization. I've just described what the terms of such a divergence might be. Now let me stop again and ask whether you'd like to question. Yes?
So I know you're talking about sort of ideal types when you give these.
Well, but the first was not an ideal type.
Okay.
As I contrasted a description of the dominant direction of the now established form of globalization with what might count as a radical alternative to it.
So I just want to look at one of your radical alternatives when you're talking about the treatment of labor versus the treatment of capital.
Yes.
Your alternative imagines that we facilitate the flows of capital, things, and labor across borders together incrementally in small steps.
Yes.
Since we already exist in a world that has emancipated to a large extent goods, services, and capital to flow across borders, but not labor, would you imagine the direction that we move in would be to restrain the flows of capital while we begin?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, you would say the free exchange of goods is sometimes bad and sometimes good, sometimes useful and sometimes not. There's a much clearer debate, not about exchange of goods, but free flows of capital. So in the period between the wars and then in Keynes, I'm going to come to the Bretton Woods Compromise, there was a great deal of opposition to free flows of capital because of their instability, their subordination of long-term development projects to short-term financial interests and so forth. But even with respect to trade, one can say the following. Trade among economies is most likely to be advantageous in two circumstances. Either when the trading economies are at a similar level of development, and then Each of them develops particular specialties, forms of production in which it is especially proficient or efficient, or when there's a radical difference between the economies. So some are at a much, much earlier stage of development than others. If, however, the relatively more backward economy is within striking range of the richer economy, in other words, there's a difference in their qualities, but their qualities are not radically different, that's the circumstance in which free trade is more likely to be questionable, because then you want to develop specialties under some shield of protection. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that the ability of the state to select in these circumstances which would lend themselves more to selection can then become the object of manipulation, of corruption, on the one hand of dogmatism, and on the other hand of a paternalistic favoritism, the promotion of certain interests. So in a sense, it is the limitation of democracy that operates as a constraint on the creation of the economic alternatives. Because this circumstance in which you would select when to have free trade and when not to have it, especially in the situation that I described of the two economies being different but not radically different, one in striking distance of the other, is what would invite selection. But selection is politically dangerous because it serves as the basis of corruption. So with the weak democracies that exist generally today in the world, the state can be penetrated and captured by interests, by powerful interests, by moneyed interests, by organized interests, and then the selection can be perverted to promote those interests. So we would have to make democracy stronger and make the democratic state less susceptible to this capture than to justify the economic selectivity that would be required by the alternative that I described. That's the problem. But it suggests then that the economic alternatives are related to political alternatives, because there are only two ways to make the state harder or less susceptible to capture. One is to create an authoritarian elite, like the Chinese Communist Party, which then, to the extent that it is not captured by economic interests, is subservient to its own interests in the preservation of its dictatorship. And its power interest then suppresses the economic alternatives. The other is to embark on the direction of a high-energy democracy, in which the whole population is mobilized, the level of popular engagement, of organized popular engagement increases, the tempo of politics is quickened, is hastened, rapid resolution of impasse, and there's a facility for decisive central action coexisting with radical devolution. So that would be the debate about which globalization, this globalization or another globalization, and that's the debate that I'm arguing, one would want to have in the world, and we don't have. Now then you can ask, and this is then the next stage of the discussion, what is the relation between this contest about alternative forms of globalization and the national alternatives which have been the main object of our discussion in the course? Now, it's clear that an alternative globalization would not arise as the gift of an enlightened international technocracy to humanity. That's not how it would happen. So how would it happen? It would happen if there are strong national projects from below, projects that require institutional divergence, the creation of alternative institutional forms of the market, like the move from a knowledge economy for the few to a knowledge economy for the many. And these strong national projects then hit against the constraints imposed by the present form of globalization. So there's a double argument here. I have to be careful. So I said before, even under the present form of globalization, there are alternative possible restraints to the same constraints that are imposed all over the world. So the Northeast Asian economies and China have responded very differently from Latin America to those same constraints, with the results that we see. But there still are constraints. And if you imagine these projects carried very much further, requiring, for example, many forms of partnership between public and private, between government and business, they would come up against the limits imposed by the present form of globalization. So then one has to imagine that there are these strong national projects, alliances among the countries that defend these strong projects, and they force down the walls of the present form of globalization. And then they create an alternative direction of globalization. And within that alternative direction, the national alternatives can in turn advance further or faster. So that's the dialectic that I'm imagining, in which the initial main movement is triggered by the strong national projects, responding to the constraints imposed by the present form of globalization. Then you open up that form, you redirect the form of globalization, and then there's more space for these national heresies. Would someone like to comment about that idea and the alternative forms of globalization? That's the way in which I'm imagining the interaction between global alternatives and national alternatives, in which the initial movement, the momentum, the pressure has to come from below, from the nation states and from their strong projects. Now, one way to examine this is to discuss an idea, a now famous idea, proposed by my co-teacher, Danny Roderick, with whom in previous years I taught this course. Roderick called it his trilemma of globalization. I'm going to explain it and say why I disagree with it and how this disagreement is connected with the debate we were just having about the alternative forms of globalization. So here's the trilemma. So the trilemma has three elements: hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, expressed, for example, in distinct national monetary and fiscal policies, and democratic politics. And what Roderick claims is that the three can't be reconciled, that you have to choose two of the three. Now you could choose any two of the three, and depending on which you choose, then you have a different combination. So if you combine radical movement toward globalization with national sovereignty, the only way to combine that is if the supposedly sovereign states all adhere to what he calls the golden straitjacket. Now, the golden straitjacket was the gold standard in the 19th century, and now the golden straitjacket is the functional alternative to the gold standard, as I described it earlier in the hour. That is, the policies also recommended by neoliberalism of inflation targeting, free-floating currencies, opening of the capital account, focus on the primary fiscal surplus. Sometimes also called sound finance doctrine. Sound finance doctrine by opposition to Keynesianism, to practical Keynesianism. If you want to have hyperglobalization and combine it with democratic politics, you need something like world federalism. You need global governance in the sense of the movement toward the creation of a world state. Could be a democratic world state, a loose confederation, but there has to be the creation of international institutions. Otherwise, you can't combine hyperglobalism with democratic politics. And if you want to combine national sovereignty with democratic politics, but reject hyperglobalization, then according to Roderick, you have what we did have before the WTO and even before the GATT, which was the Bretton Woods Compromise. There was fixed exchange rates of the sovereign states, limitations on capital flows, relative closure of the capital account, so that they could conduct their own national policies and combine them with democracy, but no hyperglobalization. That was the regime that existed in the world in the decades immediately following the Second World War. Now, what I want to say is that this trilemma cannot be accurate. First of all, it cannot be accurate for a very simple reason. Unless what we mean by hyperglobalization is a radicalization of the present form of globalization to the limit, to some idealized limit, which is incompatible with institutional or legal differences of any kind in the underlying market economies, we can't say that these three elements are irreconcilable for a very simple reason, that they're reconciled in practice right now. Right now in the world, this is what we have. The three things that the trilemma says can't be reconciled are already reconciled. All we have to do is to suppose that this hyperglobalization does not describe an idealized or radicalized limit of globalization. It describes what we have, which is globalization carried very far, but not so far that it liquidates any underlying legal or institutional difference. And what do we have for national sovereignty? So it supposes that there are not, on the whole in the world, these strong national projects. What are strong national projects? There would be projects that require massive mobilization of human, physical, and economic resources that result in a broadening of the engagement of the whole population in the national economic project. They're broad-based, as, for example, a knowledge economy for the many would be, and they take distinctive heretical institutional form. That would be what I would call strong national projects. I could rephrase that idea in terms that we've discussed before of the growth miracles. So in the elite, there's a rupture between the rentiers and the productivists. Productivism is combined with nationalism in the elites. And then the elites appeal to the mass below, and a large part of the mass is the subjective petty bourgeoisie. And that's a strong national project in which part of the elite then, in the name of nationalism and productivism, wants to equip the population to embark on a productivist project, radical, rapid economic growth, a growth miracle, requiring institutional innovation, radical institutional innovation, institutional heresies. And in democratic politics, what do we have? We have the weak democracies of today, all relatively cold democracies with low levels of popular engagement in political life, with the deliberate perpetuation of impasse among the political branches of government, and with the false idea that strong central action and radical devolution are opposites, when in fact they could be combined in ways that we've already discussed. So then, to the extent that we don't have strong national projects, but on the whole have these weaker development projects, that rarely produce growth miracles. And to the extent that the democracies that we have are weak democracies, then we can have this kind of globalization. So this kind of globalization that pushes toward convergence on the basis of the existing version of the market presupposes the weakness of democracy and the absence of the strong national projects. And that's the basis on which we have this reconciliation of the three elements. Sort of radical globalization, but moving towards it, we have weak democracy and the absence of strong national projects of growth. Now imagine a different situation. Imagine that we do have strong national projects. In just the sense I described a moment ago. Massive mobilization of human, physical, financial, technological resources, involvement of the whole population, like a war economy, although without a war, and distinctive institutions, new versions of the market. And we have then a basis for this. The constituency for this is a rebellious, productivist, national part of the elite seeking to equip this subjective petty bourgeoisie, which is the majority of the population. And instead of the weak democracies of today, we have high energy democracies that elevate the temperature of politics, the level of organized popular engagement, that hasten the pace of politics by the rapid resolution of impasse, and that combine strong central initiative with radical devolution. Then, against that background, the present form of globalization would be overthrown. And we would have a different kind of globalization, hospitable to this institutional divergence, and based on the principle that I call institutional minimalism. The minimum of restraints on institutional divergence with the maximum of opportunity to innovate in the institutional arrangements, not just the democracy, but also of the market. Now then, in that circumstance, the three elements of the trilemma would also be reconciled, but on the basis of giving a different meaning to each of the elements. So the trilemma is false for the following reason. The three elements today aren't incompatible because they're reconciled in fact in the way that I just described. And if we gave a different meaning to the elements, as I just suggested, they would also be reconciled in this alternative reality, but on another basis and with a different significance. So maybe we should have something of a discussion now of the trilemma. And this, by the way, is discussed around the world. When I was in Beijing at the Central Party School of the Communist Party, thinking that I would have a discussion about alternatives to Marxism, they asked me about Danny Roderick's trilemma. So this is going to bring me to another point later on. Yes?
When you co-teach this with Danny, what does he say to your critique?
He did not answer this critique. Someone else, another friend of ours, wrote a letter to me impersonating Danny and providing some kind of answer to this. But Danny did not respond to my critique of the trilemma. I think the basic idea was that he was trying to expose tensions in the dominant ideas. To the extent we continue on this road of globalization, we must give up either democratic politics or these strong national projects. So I think the fundamental attitude was that it wasn't like the demonstration of some logical fallacy some impossibility of reconciliation. It was a way to expose tensions in the current ideas. That was, I think, the way in which he suggested a response, but he didn't carry it out. I think this is a very important problem, because these ideological disharmonies are an essential part of the debate. Now, this is connected to a technical problem that I should mention. So there are two conventional ways of measuring globalization. And so in the rhetorical apparatus of the globalists, of the defenders of globalization, one of the instruments that they use is the barriers to trade metric of globalization, in which they say globalization is more or less depending on whether there are greater or lower barriers to trade. Now, of course, this is purely circular, because then you're building a particular view of globalization into the way in which you define and measure globalization. The alternative metric is the old, simple level of trade flows metric, which is much less circular. And so we have to, I would say, to have this kind of discussion, we have to reject the barriers of trade nomenclature and adapt instead the old level of trade, level of trade flows way of talking about globalization. So any comments about the trilemma? Well, let me add then just a final part to this narrative and try and place this discussion in a larger context. So the context in which all of this is happening, this inexplicit contest over the nature and direction of globalization, is a context in which the nature of nations is being reshaped and redefined. I touched on this earlier in the course. So the nations used to be tribes, many of them. They had tangible and therefore porous collective identities. And now they're on this road, I said, to becoming something else. The something else is a form of moral specialization within humanity. They are experiments in different ways of being human, under the shield of armed states. And on that journey from being tribes based on consanguinity and similarity to being experiments, an accident happens, I said, which is their collective identities are eviscerated. So I gave the example of the Japanese, of the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Japan is attacked by the West. It wants to maintain its independence. To maintain its independence, it comes to think, it meaning a part of its elites come to think, that it has to give up part of itself. It has to adapt not just technologies, but practices and institutions of foreign countries in order to have political, economic, and even ideological power. And combine these imports with parts of its previous identity that it keeps. And this is a process in which the tangible collective identity that existed before, the customs and practices and institutions of the Japanese people, are to some extent eviscerated. They're hollowed out, they're given up for the sake of success in this worldwide struggle for power and prosperity. And if this process of evisceration of the collective identity continues, then the collective identity becomes progressively more abstract, less susceptible to compromise, the object of an intransigent faith. And that, I said, is the characteristically poisonous character of contemporary nationalism, in which the two nations come to hate each other, not because they're becoming alike, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike and they want to be different. So the impotent rage for collective difference, the will to difference, replaces the actual difference. The actual difference was porous, vague, susceptible to compromise. The will to difference is incapable of being compromised because there's nothing to compromise. It's intangible. It's abstract. It's abstracted. And then what is the solution? The solution is not the right-wing authoritarian solution to reassert the old difference, the parts of the collective identity that were given up. It's not the liberal cosmopolitan solution of suppressing difference and allowing the differences to remain as a kind of folklore, floating over the reality of institutional convergence. The solution is to equip the desire for difference, to give the nations of the world the economic and political instruments with which to create new difference on the basis of the inherited differences. And on that view, difference is not the problem, difference is the solution. So this whole discussion of globalization is taking place against that background. And you could say that my argument is that this alternative that I've described, based on strong national projects, on high energy democracy, on globalization combined with institutional and legal minimalism, is then more hospitable to this operation of equipping the desire for difference, of creating the conditions for the creation in the world of new national difference. Now then we come to this concept which is characteristic of, especially of American diplomacy, of the rules-based international order. And the rule-based international order, if you consider this concept more closely, has two very distinct elements. So one element is the multilateral organizations, like the United Nations system and the Bretton Woods institutions, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The second element is public international common law. And those two elements have a very different character. So, public international common law is, as it were, the canonical, solid residue of all of this creative activity of the proto-law being created in liquid form by the cooperative activity of states. Its canonical reflection then, the legacy, is recorded in public international common law. Now, and that has a future, and the way to conceive it is not as a kind of codification or memorization of law, but as a prophecy. This is the consolidated, the crystallized residue of the institutional creations of a world order. That's public international common law. But the multilateral organizations, like the United Nations systems, have failed. I mean, their two characteristic entities are the General Assembly and the Security Council. The General Assembly is a debating club based on the Westphalian principle of the juridical equality of states. So the General Assembly is full of pseudo-states, mini-states that are together there with great powers. It can't be taken seriously. And the Security Council is paralyzed by the enshrinement of the veto rights of the 5 victors or putative victors of a war that ended 80 years ago. And so the United States goes to the Security Council to achieve some kind of redress of some offense to its security interest. Then it fills up the balloon with air, and if the Security Council doesn't give it because of the Chinese and Russian vetoes, then it takes the air out of the balloon and it goes outside the Security Council and it organizes a so-called coalition of the willing, which are the United States and its allies, to engage in a military expedition. So that's the only security arrangement the world has. It doesn't work. So where does the United Nations system work? It works in a completely unexpected way as the umbrella of coalitions of the willing, as in the climate talks. So you could say the defenders of globalism are constantly developing schemes for the creation of a world state. Humanity doesn't want this world state, but they keep going on, like the people who invented a constitution for Corsica or for Poland in the 18th century. It's a kind of idealized constructivism at the service of this idea of world federation of a world state. The world doesn't want a world state. And so what does work in the world? There's a plethora of proposals for the organization of the world, but there's really only one thing that works. And the only thing that works is cooperative action among the sovereign states. And to that cooperative action, we could give the name Coalitions of the Willing, the name that the Americans used for their petitions to the Security Council or their circumventions of the Security Council. So there are 3 kinds of coalitions. There's single-purpose organizations in which different states ally to solve a problem. Then there are regional coalitions like the European Union or the African Union. And then there are similar state coalitions of states that have a similar level of development or power or a similar function in the international system. And of those similar state coalitions are now 3 main examples. There's the G7, there's the G20, and there's the BRICS, which bring together Russia, China, India, Brazil, the continental developing countries, and now South Africa. So that's the only thing that works, this cooperative organization, this cooperative union of the states, to create new law, new arrangements, without a world state. On the premise, then, that the world can govern itself without having a world state. It doesn't need a world state to govern itself. It can govern itself only through cooperative action. And now, the most serious problem is the problem of armed conflict among the great powers. And we now have a unique situation in the world because the 2 great powers, the United States and China, are for different reasons, for what you might even say opposite reasons, not in communion with the rest of humanity. Not in imaginative communion with the rest of humanity. So China is a unique example in modern history of a great power that stands isolated. It has no friends, it has no allies, no real allies who want to be its allies, none. Korea, Pakistan, Cambodia, North Korea, and the people, the countries to whom it gives money are all opposed to it, resentful of it, the Belt and Road Initiative or whatever. The United States is at the extreme spectrum among the rich North Atlantic countries. It is the most unequal, the less disposed to recognize its character as a class society, the most religious, and paradoxically, in the midst of its inequalities and exclusions, the one in which the majority of ordinary men and women still seem to think that everything is possible. And its foreign policy from the beginning has been based on two principles that the rest of the world can't accept. So the first principle is that the United States will not allow any other country in any other region of the world to acquire a hegemony in its region that is so undisputed that on the basis of that consolidated regional hegemony, it can then bid for world hegemony. And the second principle, with obvious contradiction to the first, is that in the Western Hemisphere, it will enjoy an undisputed hegemony. And this was enforced by the Monroe Doctrine and then the Roosevelt Corollary. There are these two hegemons, which now are like awkward and solipsistic Gullivers, right? And so what should the rest of humanity do with them? It should do with them what the Lilliputians did with the original Gullivers. It should tie them down with strings. And the strings are these coalitions of the willing. It should involve them in a web of cooperative activity in such a way that they feel themselves to be more empowered than restrained by this web. And so what I would say is that this attempt to redirect the course of globalization has to take place against the background of the attempt to multiply these coalitions, this cooperative activity of the states, which is the basis of a proto-law, which then becomes, which has as its residue the crystallized forms of public international common law. And this is not what we want for the ultimate, because the powerful ideal in the world is the enhancement of agency. And to have these coalitions of the willing, we cannot make this ability to participate in the coalitions conditional on anything. We can't say you can do this only if you respect human rights, for example. Everyone has to participate. But we have to play for time and create the conditions under which in the future we will be able to make this participation in the cooperative activity of the sovereign states of the world conditional. Yes?
Talking about China, I was wondering that couldn't one argue that Russia wants desperately to be Chinese ally under the current circumstances?
Couldn't one argue which?
That Russia is now wanting to be China's ally more than China wants to be Russia's ally, and under these current circumstances.
No, I don't think so. I think that for sure Russia has been forced into the hands of China, but very reluctantly and with huge suspicion. So not any genuine affinity and nothing that is solid. Yes?
But this pragmatic world that we live in, there is no genuine affinity.
Yeah, I know, but it's an extreme case. The Eurasian powers are extremely suspicious of each other. There's enormous animosity among India, China, and Russia. But this is not crucial to any part of my argument. I was simply saying that the debate about globalization takes place against the background of a world disorder. The simple way to overcome world disorder would be to create a world state, or that's world federalism. And the world doesn't want a world state. And so we need a form of organization of the world economy that will leave things open, that will leave the future open, and allow us to avert the greatest danger now, which is armed conflict among the great powers. Every other danger in the world pales in significance. And so I think that this debate about the direction of globalization, of course, takes place in that larger political context of how we will create order in the world. And trade treaties, after all, bilateral or multilateral trade treaties, are an example, yet another example of these coalitions of the willing. Now take what has often been presented as a powerful model of globalization is Europe, the European Union. And we had a discussion of this earlier in the course. So the European Union is developing according to the architectural principle that the power to define the arrangements, the economic and political arrangements of the Union is centralized. And the power to define the social and educational endowments of the citizens is devolved to the national and subnational authorities. It should be exactly the opposite. That is, the Union should have as its vocation to ensure the capabilities and endowments of all of its citizens, but to give the greatest possible latitude for institutional experimentation. And that would be especially in the interest of the southern and eastern European countries. But to change the direction of the Union, they would then have to ally with the oppositional forces within France and within Germany. Now, that's related, that idea of the direction of the European Union is related to this minimalist conception of globalization based on strong national projects and on high energy democracies. So it's all, these elements are all related to one another in some way. Yes?
Yes, you mentioned before that when you were invited in Beijing, they asked you about this Rodrigues trilemma.
Rodrigues trilemma,
Yes.
yes.
Can you a little bit tell us more? How do you view China with regard to this trilemma? Because it seems to me that what we have developed so far in the course is, to some extent, of course, like not to the one related to democratic politics, but to the rest of it, or to the rest of the course, already implemented by China in a way that they are trying to put at the service of the vast majority of the population, at least the knowledge economy, through quite a complex financial system. But this financial system is now at least try to use Western financial instruments, like, for example, private equity that Rodrigues
Yes.
mentioned.
So, and what's the practical
The practical
implication?
to me, it seems that China is already ahead in implementing some form of this model that the United States cannot implement because it's a matter for the US of political dogmatism.
China is implementing which? Is developing a knowledge economy for the many?
Yeah, I think.
I don't think so. I think the Chinese economy is highly hierarchical. There's a hierarchical segmentation of the system of production. And there's a huge range of micro-institutional experimentalism in China. But all of the experiments have their potential, their fecundity to animate transformation have been limited by one question, which is the desire of the party to maintain its dictatorship, its control. And so every experiment becomes then limited by the superior logic of reconciling economic decentralization in some form with political centralism. And so the experimentalism is limited and the national debate doesn't take place. So for example, China is widely agreed has to replace its pure export orientation by deepening of the internal market. Deepening of the internal market is not an accounting operation. It's massive redistribution, which is by its very nature conflictual. It involves redistribution among classes, among regions, and among sectors. The party fears any such conflictual redistributive arrangement because it's a threat to the maintenance of political power. So there has to be a debate about what the direction of the future will be. And the absence of democracy operates as a constraint on institutional experimentalism. I think that's the reality. So every economic experiment is cut down to the extent that it threatens to destabilize political power. And so that's what we have. And so, for example, take this issue that we've discussed of technology and work, the future of work. Technology, I'd claim, has no imminent logic. And we want not just technologies that replace work, but technologies that enhance work. This is a debate that can only take place when every part of society is empowered and given a voice to participate in this contest. And that doesn't happen there. Now, it doesn't happen in the United States either. And in the United States, there's then this problem of institutional idolatry. So the Americans think they've already discovered the form of the market order and of a free society. They already have the formula. They discovered it at the beginning. And it's just from time to time they have to tweak it in some way. And this is a huge incubus on American democracy. So there have always been in the United States thinkers from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey who tried to convince their fellow citizens to lift the exemption accorded to the institutions from the experimentalist impulse, which is otherwise so alive in American culture. But they failed. So the idea in the United States is you can experiment with everything, but not about the institutions. And that's what I'm calling institutional idolatry. Institutional idolatry is a tremendous limitation on not just on democracy, but on the anarchic logic of the market. So in other words, if we look at all the states in the world, none of them is a model for the others. Each is defective. And so then the question is how we can create, we go back to this problem. We need structural alternatives. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we also want not to succumb to a structural dogmatism. So how can we have a political and economic life that is fertile in generating structural alternatives, but that prevents us from succumbing to the fetish of the institutional dogmas? And that's in part a question of the way in which we organize democracy, but also the way in which we organize the market. And here we see in the way we organize globalization. So to keep the future open, to affirm the experimental principle. And that's the heart of this discussion. And I don't think we can go around the world and say this country or that country is the wave of the future or the model for what we want. We can look in each country for examples of the direction, but we won't find these examples systematically represented in the picture of the whole. And now there's this paradox in the world, right? We were speaking about China. The world is restless under this yoke of the dictatorship of no alternatives. There are these great countries like China, like India, Brazil, which have the practical and spiritual resources to imagine themselves as different worlds. But even in these countries, there is the incubus of mental colonialism. So they're highly conscious of their potential, but there they are. And, you know, instead of discussing their ideas about the future, they're discussing the reflexive ideas of the Americans, like in the Central Party School. And so this is the complicated situation in which the potential for rebellion, for heresy, for fertile divergence is radically limited by these spiritual elements, which are entirely surprising, unexpected. Well, I'm not going to require you to continue the discussion if you're not disposed to. Is there any other question, any other argument that you'd like to present? Yes.
How do you see the future of Web3 and DAO?
The future of which?
Web3.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the word.
Um,
The future of? Help me.
Web
Future of what?
Web 3.
Web 3?
Yeah.
What is Web 3? I don't know.
It's not even.
yeah, so I guess like I found a lot of the ideas about Web3 and DAO similar to a lot of the ideas you present in the class is basically the idea that you would have these like, they're like still kind of alliance, like very new, you would have these communities and
An alliance of?
no, you would have these like discrete communities, and they're just like individual members, and basically anyone could contribute to the community to like distribute tasks and everything. And the idea is that basically it's very like decentralized and a more like equitable community, and it's not limited by like borders, and it's like on like the cryptocurrency chain, that kind of thing.
So what is the question or what is the problem?
I was just thinking, how do you see that, like the future of that technology integrating with the ideas you presented? Like, because you talk a lot about radical decentralization.
I think I can put a refinement on the question. So I think, to me, the question is about the role of tech. So one of the big arguments, piece of the argument is that labor is not as mobile as everything else, the other factors of production.
The argument
Therefore,
about globalization.
yeah, so therefore we have this problem with labor mobility. So things like Web3 are decentralized electronic technologies that both decentralize ownership of information, but also potentially break down physical limitations on the mobility of labor. How do those pieces redefine the problem?
Absolutely. So I think the evolution of these technologies creates a whole range of opportunities, which is very different from saying that the technology has an imminent logic of evolution that goes in a particular direction. So people study the technologies and think that somehow economic decentralization or political decentralization will be a gift of the technological evolution. And it never really happens that way. It will be a gift if we make it give us that, but we're the ones who are in charge, right? And we have to direct the technology in one way or another. If Poincaré said, chance favors the prepared mind. So if we stock our imagination with these ideas about alternatives, political and economic alternatives, then technological evolution or the evolution of anything else can provide us with all of these opportunities. But we have to come to the opportunities with a mind prepared to look in that direction. And much of thought is the attempt to present us with a kind of fate, right? And thought should be a rebellion against fate. So globalization is the classical example. So throughout the world, globalization has become an alibi for different kinds of surrender. So if you propose this or that economic policy, they say you can't do that because there will be capital flight, because there'll be noxious economic consequences. But what you see around the world is that within this established form of globalization, different parts of the world have responded in very different ways. I gave today the example of the Northeast Asia versus Latin America. And the present form of globalization does impose a constraint. Within that constraint, we can respond in very different ways. And then if we form projects that are strong enough, we can overthrow the present regime of globalization. Under the pressure of these strong national projects coming from below. And so all of these things that are supposedly just part of the chorus of fate then become part of the invitation to the creation of alternatives. We'll continue next week.